How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak. Thanks for joining us today for How I Got Here, PhocusWire and Mozio's podcast about innovation in travel and transportation. Today we're joined by Steve Hafner. Steve is the CEO of Kayak, which he founded along with Paul English in 2003. Before Kayak, he was the EVP and on the founding team of Orbitz. Kayak was acquired in 2013 by the Booking Group, where Steve continues to lead Kayak, OpenTable, Momondo, and several other travel brands. Thanks for coming, Steve.
Hey, David. Thanks for and Kevin, for that matter. Thanks for the opportunity.
Of course. So we always like to start these with the same question, which is to ask you to explain how you got here.
Well, I think you reached out to my media team and invited me on the show, but I'm just being facetious.
Oh, they actually reached out to us. So set the record straight, but go on.
I get the sense this is the way it's going to go, this one.
Yeah, we're going to have some fun. No, I've been in the travel business for a long time. I helped start a company called Orbitz back in the day, gosh, over 20 years ago. And at the time, I was working for a PowerPoint shop called Boston Consulting Group. And we had been retained by a group of airlines right after the Expedia IPO to try to come up with an answer to it. And worked there for a bit. That project eventually turned into Orbitz, where I was there for 4 years, watched it grow from like 6 people to 1,600. And it was really successful. And then we took it public. 2 weeks after we took it public, I quit and started Kayak, and I've been here ever since. And the insight that differentiated Kayak from Orbitz is, while I was at Orbitz, we were a store, so we would only show you the airlines and hotels that we could sell you, because that's how we made money. And as a result, half the people were going directly to other sites to book. And I just thought, we could do it better if we were a search engine and not a store, and that turned into Kayak. So that's a short story.
I think that's the shortest answer I've ever heard from you, actually. That's terrific. Okay, right. Okay, let's go right back. So how did you get involved specifically in the Orbitz thing, and how did that kind of all come together and you work with the team and figure out your role there, because you were SVP of something or other, right?
Yeah, consumer travel, which at the time was 97% of what Orbitz did. We had a small business travel operation, but it was inconsequential. Still is, actually. But I was working for this management consultancy, BCG, putting these elaborate PowerPoint decks together that was just overpaid bad advice, and the airlines wanted someone to help them with this e-commerce strategy. And they didn't want anyone from the travel business, because Continental was a BCG client out of Houston, American was a BCG client out of Dallas, and then United was a BCG client out of Chicago. So they didn't want anybody from either of those 3 offices to be on the founding team of Orbitz, because they thought they'd be biased. So they picked me and a handful of other BCG folks to staff the project, because we didn't know anything about what we were doing. And nonetheless, it still worked out.
It says here on your LinkedIn page, you were one of the best PowerPoint monkeys on the staff at BCG.
Yeah, I'm probably bragging when I shouldn't be. There were some really good monkeys on that staff.
Okay, but that is your crowning moment if it's on your LinkedIn page, right?
Just to quickly follow up on that, what's interesting is that I think there's a lot of outsiders and Silicon Valley types who want to try to disrupt the travel industry and come in and don't really understand it. Obviously, that seemed to be an advantage for you guys, and then you were able to actually take that experience and then go to Kayak and go start Kayak, and straddle the line between not getting so bogged down in industry minutia, but also having a fresh viewpoint. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so look, back when we started Orbitz in '99, it was still okay to be an amateur, because you weren't going head to head against anybody who knew anything, because the internet was so new. But I wouldn't recommend that today. But what it did teach me is the value of fresh eyes on a problem, and that you're better off hiring athletes versus hiring experienced people. So, it really informed how we've picked people to work at Kayak and our other brands. We look for really smart, driven people who are enthusiastic and are problem solvers. Not that, hey, we're doing a flight business, so have you worked at an airline or another online travel agency or a GDS? No, we'd rather go get someone who has a job offer from Google and Facebook and others and bring them onto the team.
If I could just elaborate on that, it's funny. This is something I notice with a lot of other travel startup founders. They end up spending $100,000 or $200,000 on a salesperson who has a bunch of check boxes by their name and all this experience, and the person doesn't know how to hustle or something like that. And I might be decimating our viewership here at the current moment by saying this, but I agree with you. I think it's definitely better to focus on those athletes, those people who have natural ability and can figure it out.
I totally agree. I mean, there's a couple other things that are important, right? It's the cultural fit, and are these people good coaches as well, instead of just being individual performers, and some other stuff. But overall, for your listeners who are budding entrepreneurs, talent really matters, because it's not just about the idea, because in the internet age, especially in technology, the idea itself can be replicated. It's the execution that matters, and it's the talent that actually executes against the idea. So, the first 5 hires are really critical. The next 10 hires that they pick should be even stronger than the initial 5, et cetera, and on down the road.
And the formation of Kayak then. We spoke to Terry Jones on the podcast about 6 or 7 episodes ago.
Yep.
And he talked us through from his perspective how all that kind of came together. How much of all that was because you were at Orbitz and then you left to start Kayak fairly quickly, right?
I did.
How much of the planning was involved between the two, and how did it all kind of come together, and working with Terry and meeting him and just the coalition of everything coming together? Because it's an unusual way of starting a company. It was built from within a VC outwards rather than a nascent idea in your garage, right?
Yeah, I mean, success has many parents, right? So, and everyone has a slightly different view about it. So, when I was at Orbitz, I was always, after we had built this thing, I was looking for something else to do, and I still wanted to stay in the travel business, like so many of us who are in the travel business want to do, is recirculate, right? And a good friend of mine, Joel Cutler, who was a partner at General Catalyst, which is top tier East Coast VC, actually a global VC these days, because they've been so successful, came to me and said, "Hey, Steve, we're thinking about making an investment in this company called Sidestep. If we do, would you like to come on board to be the founding CEO?" And I said to him, "Actually, Sidestep's interesting, but it's just a little plug-in, a little browser that would launch when you visited an airline site or Orbitz and show you Southwest results, basically." And I said, Joel, instead of writing a check for 40% and a big check at that, why don't you write a much smaller check and we can own 100%? And this is the product we need to build. It's not a plugin for your browser, which, by the way, was Netscape at the time. It was let's build a website that was a destination in and of itself that people could go to and search all this stuff. And he thought that resonated. He brought in his good friend Terry, who I'd known because he was the CEO of Travelocity. And he bounced the idea off of him. Terry said, "That's a pretty good idea. Let's go ask another person." And that was Greg Slingstad, who was, I think first CEO of Expedia or first COO, and had been there for a long, long time. And he said, "Yeah, this is a pretty good idea. The 4 of us are sitting around in Boston talking about it, and we're like, there's something here." So, that was the origin story, if you will. And then the how I met Paul English is a type of story in and of itself.
Yeah, well, we'll come to the union with Paul in a while. I just think it's quite interesting in the, they had, in some sense, a very small vision for investing in Sidestep, and you came along and said, no, this is what we can do. Did they need much persuading, do you think?
It was a 6-page PowerPoint deck, and that was enough.
Okay. And you are the PowerPoint master, as you learned at Boston Consulting Group, right?
Exactly. I still have that deck somewhere. It's in a really bad yellow background, but again, I think I said it earlier. Great ideas are out there, and having one site that searched all the other travel sites was an idea that other people had, but no one had actually executed against it. So it's the execution that matters.
So what was what do you think was the hardest part of that execution? Just while we're on this theme, before I do want to get onto the Paul English thing in a minute, but what was the most difficult part in that really, really early phase once you'd persuaded Joel and the others to kind of go with your idea rather than the sidestep plugin idea?
Yeah, the toughest part, other than the plumbing, which is actually getting a company up and running, was actually getting commercial agreements with all these airlines and OTAs to play with us, right? To let us search their sites and compete against them, to get paid for the pleasure, and then to actually have a business model where consumers found out about us and came back. I mean, you got to remember that we started Kayak at a very different time than when we started Orbitz. When we started Orbitz, it was still the Wild West on the internet. You could raise a ton of capital, you could go out market people, have $100 million TV ad campaigns, et cetera. In 2003, it wasn't the Wild West anymore. You had Expedia, Travelocity, and Orbitz as the big three in the US on the OTAs. The airlines had their own sites, and there wasn't that much perceived market need for a site like Kayak.
Okay. Right. Okay. Well, let's get the Paul English thing out the way then. So how did you meet Paul? What did you make of him, and what do you think he made of you? Because I think I say respectfully that you're fairly different personalities, at least outwardly.
Yeah, we're very different folks, and I would observe that a lot of great companies have co-founders because they're complementary. No one person can do it all, and all the areas where I suck, Paul is great at, and that's what made it work, right? So I can't write a line of code, or at least I couldn't then. So Paul was my CTO, he was my co-founder, he was my thought partner, et cetera. But going back to your original question, how did I meet him? Well, I had this short PowerPoint deck, but I had a problem, which is I couldn't code. And I had agreed when I left Orbitz not to take any of their people with me, at least for a year. After a year, I went back and got them all. But so I was talking to Joel Cutler and Terry, and Joel said, well, I know this great programmer in Boston who has started a few companies and sold them successfully. Maybe he can point you the right direction. So I met Paul at Legal Seafood in the basement of the General Catalyst offices in Harvard Square, and had lunch and walked him through the idea. And 15 minutes into it, he's like, let's do this together. And we agreed to co-found it. We both agreed to put in a couple $1 million each. And we went upstairs to Joel Cutler and said, hey, Joel, that $6 million pre-money valuation you were giving us, now it's 12.5. And if you don't like it, we're gonna go chop the deal. And I think Joel at that point in time was like, oh shit. Well, they de-risked the deal. He's got a CTO now, and we've got more capital because they're both putting money into it. So I'll swallow my lumps and go for it. So it was a very expensive lunch for Joel Cutler, but a very productive one for Kayak.
What's interesting is you said something there. You said you didn't know how to program at all, and there's a lot of people, since a lot of our listeners are potential startup founders who don't know how to program and sometimes can come across as the quote-unquote ideas guy searching for a coder. But you also paid your dues at Orbitz. You also had all this background and knew Joel Cutler, knew all these different people. I'm curious how you would recommend to other potential startup founders, about the route you took versus maybe versus the other route of just kind of saying, screw it, I'm right out of college and starting something.
It all depends on your appetite for risk, right? So I didn't have a huge appetite for risk. I was married and had a couple kids. So I wanted to make sure if I was going to leave one startup Orbitz for another Kayak, that I was maximizing the chance of that startup being successful. So, and I think there's no substitute for experience in terms of helping you be successful. And then there's no substitute for having complementary team members who know parts of the business that you don't, or have capabilities you don't, whether that's financial or marketing or how to raise money or how to write code. So I was just trying to maximize my chances for success. And it's one thing to start a business coming out of school when you really don't know that much, but you have an idea, but you also don't have a mortgage or kids. So if you fail, you can go get a job somewhere else. It's quite another to say, I'm going to start something and I'm going to be successful at it because I need to be successful at it.
Yeah, I think
that's kind of where I was.
Yeah, there's definitely sometimes a stereotype of everyone has to do the Mark Zuckerberg thing, and there's a whole bunch of different ways of skinning a cat. So, cool. Well, I'd love to just delve a little bit more into how we kind of alluded to it generally about how execution, and I feel like that's a term that's just thrown around generally and often not really explained exactly how you executed. And so I'd be curious to kind of like, there was Mobissimo, Fair Chase, obviously you mentioned Sidestep. There was a bunch of different, options out there. You mentioned the, kind of the insight you had that you felt Sidestep maybe didn't. How did you, what was your North Star when it came, when it came to strategy and execution that you felt you understood that everyone else didn't really get?
Sure, it comes down to a handful of very straightforward things, but are very hard to practice consistently over time. The first one is it's all about the product, right? Anytime we had a trade-off to make, we always erred on the side of the customer and the product. And we built the product that we wanted to use, right? Fast, advanced, cool filters. If a supplier didn't agree to pay us, we'd include the results anyway. So we err on the side of comprehensiveness. At that point in time, we had a very light touch on commercialization, like ads and pop-ups and all that kind of crap. So it was not too dissimilar from when Google emerged on the scene, and there was lots of other travel search engines out there. They just out-executed them with a discipline on consumer and customer first and product first. So that's the first part. The second part is I wanted to make sure that we were very partnership oriented. So we went out and did deals with everybody. Anybody who came to us with an idea, be that a distribution partner or an airline or a marketing partner, we were open for business. And we moved very quickly to partner with them. We did everything on win-win terms. And everything, if it didn't work out, they could get out on 30 days notice. So we did business the way people wanted to do business. And then the last aspect was I knew we'd need a lot of capital to win. We might have to outshout people. We might want to do M&A and buy them and push for scale. So I wanted to be the best at raising money. And we were, we were absolutely the best at taking capital in the marketplace, and we were willing to give up significant pieces of our company to do so. And I still think that's a strategy that a lot of startups miss. They'd rather own the whole grape than part of the watermelon, as the jargon goes. I'm much more a piece of the watermelon kind of fellow.
It's interesting, Steve. I can jump in before David carries on. You said right at the beginning there, you used to err on the side of the customer and the product.
That's
when
right.
You were growing, rather than erring on the side of what makes money potentially. How did you square that with your early investors if they saw you always going on the side of the customer and the product, which is obviously was the right thing to do, but they'd invested in you, right?
They had invested in us, but you're not trying to make money on your first 5,000 users. You're trying to make money on your first 50 million users, was the way we always talked about it. And we were also very fortunate early on to have Mike Moritz join our board from Sequoia Capital. Okay. And there's this bias of East Coast venture capitalists at that time to focus on monetization and P&L and making money. And the bias was the exact opposite on the West Coast at the time, which was go for maximum audience growth and scale, and then you'll figure out how to monetize it later. So we had a perfect balance between the two, with General Catalyst on one side out of Boston and Sequoia Capital out of Menlo Park to thread the needle there.
It's a delicate balancing act almost.
It is. It's funny. Sequoia came in and invested in us at the same time they invested in this other company called YouTube. And I was talking to Chad Hurley, who's one of the co-founders of YouTube, and we were both coming out of Sequoia board meetings. And he's like, "Wow, Mike Morris was just beating the shit out of me about our P&L and how much money we're losing." And I said, "Wow, that's funny. He was just telling me that I should be less focused on making money and more about audience growth. So, you know, it all worked out, but it is funny how the, you know, putting customer first, which is what YouTube did, more successfully, I'd say, than we did, certainly. But they broke out of a pack of a ton of video sharing sites. And when we broke out of a ton of search sites.
Yeah.
So I think the philosophy makes sense.
I'm sure there's a joke there about somewhere about them YouTube selling to Google and you didn't, but I obviously won't. I won't make it.
Yeah, he sold for more though, so.
Well, yeah. Well, it's funny. We had a healthy competition with those guys, and after they sold, Paul and I said, we're never selling for less than what YouTube sold for.
So yeah, I think I want to rewind and ask a little bit about your fundraising comment. One thing we've talked about is, you know, the difference between Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar really is, you know, who was best at fundraising and pitching that narrative. And I think there's a strain of thought that says as long as you have a good product and bootstrap, that's it. But in many cases, that's not true. And it sounds like you're on the other side of that spectrum. And I would love if you could elaborate a little bit more about how, you know, competence in fundraising and being the best at raising money really guaranteed your guys' success.
Yeah, for sure. Because look, all things being equal, if you have a great idea, other people are going to have that idea too. And there's probably going to be a stage of your development where your product may be largely comparable to somebody else's. And you know, that's when you want to have the bankroll and the strategic investors behind you to actually outspend and outmuscle that competitor. So I think fundraising is just one of those skills that you need to have to be a really successful entrepreneur if you're operating in a competitive, crowded marketplace.
Great. Now, yeah, I think we've had a fair amount of varying viewpoints on that. So it's you use some of that funds to acquire Sidestep. So I kind of wanted to segue into how did you guys think about once you guys did raise those funds? Apparently it wasn't just a browser extension. It was going to be somewhat valuable to you guys. I'd love to hear a little bit about that too.
Sure. So Sidestep. So Sidestep was a San Francisco darling. Most people who are listening to this podcast have never heard of Sidestep, but it had a decent amount of market traction. It was still mainly a plugin. They had, after Kayak had launched, they had tried to retrofit what they were doing to be a website too. And they had a fair bit of audience against it. But, you know, Paul and I looked at the math and said, look, we can go out there and we can spend money to convince Sidestep users to use Kayak instead, because it's a better product. And this is how much it's going to cost us to actually find Sidestep users and convert them to Kayak users. And then we said, or we could just buy them. And we knew we could raise money. And we could raise that at a much more attractive valuation and gain both scale, eliminate a competitor, you know, so it just all worked out. So, you know, it was, at the time we bought them, we were 33 people at Kayak doing 50 million in revenue. They were 105 people doing 30 million in revenue. Mm-hmm. So we just knew we had a better business model. We raised a couple $100 million and we got the deal done in 3 weeks.
Well, it's funny because there's a few examples like this, you know, ClassPass, and I forget who their competitor was, Didi, and I think it was Quitey Dash. And then there's a few big examples of this. The biggest, most famous one, of course, is like X and PayPal, right? Yeah. I've always thought whenever I heard those stories that it must be a little bit of a gut punch to merge and to give up even more of your company, and to perhaps seed that battleground. Like a lot of founders have a lot of pride, right? They want to win. And how did you feel, like, just, you know, not the logic, you answered the question extremely logically, like, and how did you feel about it? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, to some extent, we figured if we had waited 2 more years, we could have gotten them for far cheaper. And so, you know, we were holding our nose a little bit buying it because we knew we were going to shut it down and we didn't need their people, right? So, you know, actually, it was a week before Christmas when we got the deal done. We went to their offices and basically took out their whole staff. And then 3 months later, we redirected the URL to Kayak. So it was I don't want to say it's brutal, but it was a fairly short transition from sidestep to kayak. Um, I don't mind the fact that we probably overpaid for them and we did it too early, because it gave us scale so quickly in the market, and that allowed us to build the momentum to, the US basically then on the meta market we owned. And now they gave us the permission to springboard the US to international markets.
It's funny, you said something there, like you own the US meta market. And I know that I want to segue this a little bit. You currently lead 7 different brands at Booking Holdings, one of which is Momondo, one of which is OpenTable. I remember hearing stories about how Momondo really focused on Denmark and a couple other places, carved out a niche in, if I remember correctly, TV advertising, and there was a bunch of different regional plays that had, like, I know Kayak has made attempts at going to Europe. I actually don't know the full success of how successful you guys were as a kayak brand, but to some extent, if you acquired Momondo, right, that was you recognize they did something well in their region. Can you talk about how you view the difference between meta search in different countries, and why did you guys decide to acquire these other companies?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a long history of, particularly in Europe and now in APAC, savvy people seeing what's working in the US and deciding to replicate that on a local basis. And the meta search market was no different. So as soon as we started Kayak and we started getting some traction, there were meta search sites opening up in Scandinavia like Momondo, in the UK like Cheap Flights, in Germany like Swoodoo, in Austria like Check Felix. These are all brands that we ended up acquiring. And what was underlying their development was they had local market expertise. They knew how to acquire customers. They plugged in local suppliers and local online travel agencies. And they got traction in those markets. And we had to do the same calculus when we looked at them as when we looked at Sidestep, which is, okay, do I want to go in these markets and compete with them and convince people through marketing and product experience that they should be using Kayak instead of Momondo or instead of Swoodoo? Or do I just want to reach an accommodation with these folks on the financial side, on the M&A side, and then figure out a good way to operate them? And that's where we ended up with each of these, which is the first one we bought was Swoodoo, then we bought Check Felix in Austria, then we ended up buying Momondo and Cheap Flights together. We bought Mundi down in Brazil, Hotels Combined out of Sydney for the APAC market. And what we did was a little bit more nuanced than what we did with Sidestep, which is we kept their brands, we kept their look and feel. We just made them a storefront sitting on front of the back end kayak infrastructure. So it was the same search infrastructure, the same distribution. It was just basically a different flavor of ice cream that we were selling out of the ice cream manufacturing. So
the interesting thing about that, the acquisitions in Europe, is that you did try to go in with your own brand of ice cream before. I remember Keith Melnick was the first kayak person that I ever met in London in 2000, and you're going to tell me the year 2007, maybe something like that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good memory, Kevin.
And Keith was bringing kayak to Europe. So what lessons did you learn? Because you tried to you tried to launch the brands. I mean, you had a fairly hefty competitor in would have been Travel Supermarket back in those days, and Skyscanner. But I mean, yeah. I can see you smiling.
Yeah.
We all remember Travel Supermarket, but I mean, the point is that you did try to bring the kayak brand in first, and then perhaps realized it was going to be more difficult than if you did go and buy Swoodoo and some of the others.
Yeah. So the first stage in all these markets is we localized Kayak and we brought Kayak to those markets. But developing the product and the commercial relationships wasn't the hard part. The hard part was getting marketing traction with consumers.
Yeah.
And consumers are habitual. So once they've started using a meta search site, you got to give them a really darn good excuse to switch. And the reality is, Momondo did a good job serving Scandinavian needs. Swoodoo did a good job serving German needs. So the barrier for us to switch those folks over to Kayak was going to be expensive. Not to say that Kayak wasn't getting traction in those markets. It is. In Germany, we operate with Kayak, Swoodoo, and Momondo as 3 different meta brands. And all of them have big audiences, but we knew the formula of pursuing scale, even if it came at the expense of a little bit of M&A and writing checks, was the right strategy. And you fast forward to today, this year, well, the past 12 months, we did 6 billion consumer queries for travel information across these 7 brands globally. So scale matters.
Yep. Okay. Well, before we get on to some of the latter parts of that period leading up to the IPO and the acquisition and things, I mean, that period did coincide with the entry, if we can call it that, of Google. They bought ITA software, and you were a very vocal, inevitably, executive commenting on that deal. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the what was the lobbying group? Fair Search. I think you were involved in Fair Search. I mean, was that potentially the first time that you thought, okay, this isn't perhaps not going all our way, possibly? Because up until then, certainly in North America, you had it all your own way, really. There was very little coming along to bite you on the backside, but then all of a sudden Google was getting in on the game. And I just wonder whether that was the first time you just thought,
Yeah, no, I mean, we always knew Google was going to be the space. All of our pitch decks as we raised money, the first question we get asked in the Q&A was, well, what about Google? And, we always said, look, Google's always going to chase us. They're always going to be 2 or 3 steps behind us, but they do have the benefit of global scale, of vertical breadth, and of having a free audience, unlimited engineering wherewithal, and great access to capital. So, if travel meta was going to be one of their top 3 priorities, they could put a hurting on us, but we didn't have to beat Google to win. Ultimately, Kayak and the other brands, we have a great business that performs solidly, even if Google is strong in the marketplace. So Google for us was always a company that we did a lot of business with, that we had a lot of respect for, but not one that we looked for product inspiration or innovation. We've always been ahead of them,
Yeah.
and today is no different. And their growth in the US market, which I think is the one where they've got the most share, hasn't come at our expense. It's come at the expense of people going directly to airlines and directly to OTAs.
Yeah.
People are still going to Kayak.
I remember you saying at a Q&A or something, or a word association round at a PhocusWire conference, someone said to you Google, and you said something similar to, we don't look at it for product inspiration, but it is shit lightning fast, or something like that. I think that was how you summarized it back in those early days.
Yeah, no, the product is fast, but that's because Google has to be fast. It's actually their Achilles heel.
Yeah.
People expect Google to deliver you instant results, and the only way they can do that is to not wait for slow suppliers to give them cheaper fares.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Kayak, if you're willing to wait 3 seconds or so, you'll get a better answer with Kayak than you will for Google. And I think when you open your wallet and you're about to make a $700 airfare purchase, it pays to wait 3 seconds.
That's a really interesting insight, that their brand is all about being quick, and that actually could be kind of harmful to them. What I wanted to ask actually is about like vertical marketplaces versus horizontal marketplaces. Clearly, like a lot of people point to Amazon snatching up diapers.com and a lot of stuff like that, and eventually you couldn't actually exist as a Zappos because they just had such market power. It's clear that you don't believe that's going to happen in the travel industry. Why do you think the travel industry is kind of inoculated from that?
Well, it hasn't happened in the travel industry yet, right? And I think the reality is the travel, let's call it in the US, 10, 12% of GDP. So it's a really big category. And as a result, it's not going to be a winner take all. You're going to have successful breadth players like Google. You're going to have successful vertical players like Kayak. And then even within that, if you're a supplier or an OTA, you can actually do a good job with a much smaller business. So I think it's the game is still rapidly evolving on this front. So I wouldn't pick today and say this is the end state. The end state may well be that a horizontal player wins, but I still think it's going to be a healthy environment for everybody else. And I'm very intent on making sure that Kayak is one of the winners.
Okay, I've got two points I wanted to kind of finish up with, Steve, if that's okay. I'm sure someone will correct me. We always have wisecracks telling us when we've got things wrong, but I believe you're one of the longest serving digital travel CEOs now, if not the most longest serving one. I mean, the question that I often comes to mind is, why do you stick around on something that's about product and brand versus something that's to go and do something that's perhaps new and fresh and challenges your brain in a different way to the way it's perhaps being challenged now by running a company that you know inside out for the last 15 years or whatever?
Yeah, because I've done a really shitty job making Kayak what it should be, we started out trying to make an app that gave you a complete picture of all your travel options worldwide, made it easier to travel, did all these cool things for you, and we're not there yet. I've been at it for 15 years, and we're still not there yet. So, until I run out of gas on the product and inspiration side, there's no other place I want to be. And yeah, I've been here for a long period of time, but since I've been here, there's been so many changes in the industry, right? I mean, when I started Orbitz, we were still printing paper tickets, right? Most of your audience probably has never even seen a paper ticket. And then we went to electronic tickets, and then we went from like web fares via email to actually accessing the internet. And then we made a transition to mobile, and then to apps, and now maybe to super apps. We'll see. But no, we have a lot of stuff to get done at Kayak and our other travel meta brands, and at OpenTable and across the group. And I'm having a heck of a lot of fun, and there's no place I'd rather be.
Okay, that's encouraging hopefully encouraging for all your employees. I mean, this kind of leads me to the final point, and I think it's fair to say that you've got a fairly, in the public arena, people see you on stage at conferences and things like that, and they'll hear you on this. You've got a fairly combative kind of personality in some respects. You kind of shoot from the hip, if that's the phrase I need to use, and stuff like that, which is very different to other. As a journalist, we love it because it's Mr. Soundbite. Here comes Steve Hafner. It's great. But it's your kind of, as I say, is your combative public persona the way you are with your team and in the office, or is it kind of I'm not going to say it's just for show, but I just wondered what is the Steve in the office like compared to the Steve that we see on stage?
I would hope people would tell you it's the same. I don't perceive myself as combative. I see myself as direct. I'm going to tell you the way I think it is. Yep. And I'm going to try to solicit as much input to make sure that what I'm telling you is actually true and accurate.
Yep.
And, I think we're on to the right track at Kayak, and innovation and products is what we care about, and we care about making an impact. And I've just been fortunate to work with a lot of really talented people through the years that we've been able to make a difference. And, I speak at your events because I love you, Kevin, and I love Focusrite, and I don't speak at many other stuff. But while I'm there talking to people in the industry, it's fun to throw an elbow or two occasionally.
There are no complaints.
And the industry needs it.
There are no complaints from me and my comrades on the journalist side and at Focusrite, that's for sure. I mean, I always remember shortly after the acquisition, I think it was a couple of days after the acquisition, you were on stage with Jeff Boyd. And, it had happened the day before or something. And you just couldn't see two contrasting types of leaders of businesses in a complementary way. I mean, what was it like working with somebody like Jeff Boyd, who I think you ask anybody and they say he was very presidential and, he could have been an ambassador to the UN. He had that kind of style. I wondered whether, what it was like working with someone like Jeff.
Jeff is one of my mentors. I really look up to him, as well as my current CEO, Glenn Fogel. He's much more adept than I am at being situational aware and adjusting his deportment to the situation.
Okay. I think that's probably a great point to end on. So thank you very much from David and I, Steve Hafner, for joining us on How I Got Here.
Thanks, David.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. You've been listening to another episode of How I Got Here. This is Mozio and PhocusWire's weekly inside stories around travel and transportation and innovation. We thank you very much for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed listening to Steve Hafner from Kayak, and tune in for another episode. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more inside stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages. And get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.